Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome. Today is the start of March, so I figured I'm going to be breaking off from doing the traditional Irish tales and going to something that's a little bit more, important. Well, not necessarily important, but it's definitely needed. And this is basically March I see as Irish History Month. So I'm going to try and do a video every day about something to do with Irish history, whether it's pre-Christian or from Christian era on, both all the way up to modern. So sit back, smash that subscribe button, enjoy a horn of mead, and relax to today's tale on the Irish Genocide, also known as the potato famine. So keep in mind, these are my thoughts from my research. You, through your research, may have had something different, but this is just information that I'm going to give you on the known as the Great Famine, also the Irish Genocide or the Irish Potato Famine. Now, let's get into it. We all know that the Irish and potatoes go hand in hand, just like the Irish and music. I'm going to be referring it to as either the Great Famine or the Irish Potato Famine in this. So, let's get into it. The Great Famine, also known as An Gorta Mór, also known within Ireland as the Great Hunger, or simply the famine, and outside Ireland as the Irish Potato Famine, was a period of starvation and disease in Ireland, and it lasted from 1845 to 1852, so almost 10 years. It constituted a historical social crisis which subsequently had major impact on Irish society and the history as a whole, with the most severely affected areas in the west and the south of Ireland, where the Irish language was dominant. So there's a first key that it might have been to suppress the Irish people from speaking the Irish language, or Gaelic. The period was compensatory known in Irish as a dronscoil, literally translated as the bad life, and loosely translated as the hard times. The worst year of the period was 1847, which became known as Black 47. During the Great Hunger, roughly 1 million, let me say that again, roughly 1 million people died, and more than 1 million fled the country. So that means during this time, the country's population fell by 20 to 25%, and in some towns falling as much as 67% between 1841 and 1871. Between 1845 and 1855, at least 2.1 million people left Ireland. Let me say that again. Between 1845 and 1855, 2.1 million people left Ireland, primarily on packet ships, but also on steamboats and brugs. One of the greatest exoduses from a single island in history. The proximate cause of the famine was potato blight that infected potato crops throughout Europe during the 1840s, causing an additional 100,000 deaths outside of Ireland, and influencing much of the unrest in the widespread European revolutions of 1848. Longer-term causes include the system of absentee lordism and single crop dependence. Let me say that again. The longer-term causes of this included the system of absentee lordism and single crop dependence. Lordism is, in economics, an absentee landlord is a person who owns and rents out a property but does not live within the property's local economic region. The term absentee ownership was popularized by the economics Thorsten Veblen's 1923 book of the same name. That means that part of the issue and why it got so bad was that landlords, because they didn't live there or live in the area, didn't really give a shit. And the other big issue, single crop dependence. In agriculture, monoculture is practice of growing one crop species in a field at a time. Monoculture is widely used for intensive farming and in organic farming, both a 1,000-hectare cornfield and a 10-hectare field of organic kale are monocultures. Monocultures of crops allowed farmers to increase efficiency of planting, maintaining, and harvesting. But with that comes, if you rely on just one crop, something like the potato blight could decimate an entire population, which it did. There are theories that the Great Famine was that the British didn't do enough to help because they wanted at that time to get rid of the Irish language. And they were fighting to get their hold and make them, that it be a non-go, that it just get to, English. Again, this is theories that people have behind it and why it's a genocide instead of just a famine. But now, in initial limited but constructive government actions to alleviate famine distress were ended by a new wing of administration in London, which pursued a laissez-faire economic doctrine and only resumed later. Now, the laissez-faire type of economic system is which transactions between private groups of people are free from any form of economic interventionism. As a system thought, Isaac Farrell resists the following axionism: an individual is the basic unit in society. The refusal of London to bar export of food from Ireland during the famine was an immediate and continuing source of controversy, contributing to anti-British sentiment and the campaign for independence. Additionally, the famine indirectly resulted in tens of thousands of households being evicted, exacerbated by the provision forbidding access to a workhouse aid where in possession of more than 1/4 hectare of land. Now, the famine was a defining moment in the history of Ireland. That's why I like starting with it, which is part of the United Kingdom's Great Britain and Ireland from 1801 to 1922. The famine and its effects primarily changed the island's demographic, political, and cultural landscape, producing an estimated 2 million refugees. Now, let me say that again. Producing an estimated of 2 million refugees from a single island. This spurring a century-long population decline. For both the native Irish and those resulting dysphoria, the famine entered folk memory. The strained relations between many Irish and their ruling British government worsened further because, the famine heightened the ethnic and sanction tensions, boosting nationalism and republicanism, both in Ireland and among Irish immigrants around the world. English documentary maker John Percival said that the famine became part of a long story of betrayal and exploitation, which led to the growing movement in Ireland for independence. Scholar Kirby Maker makes the same point. Debate exists regarding the norm culture of the event. Whether to use the term famine, potato famine, or great hunger, and or genocide, as a list of what some believe most accurately captures the complicated history of the period. The potato blight returned to Europe in 1879. By this time, the Land War was one of the largest agrarian movements to take place in the 19th century Europe, had begun in Ireland. The movement, organized by Land League, continued the political campaign for the 3 Fs, and the 3 Fs were known as for sale, fixity, and fair rent. So at this time they were fighting back, basically, to get a good, decent price. It was issued in 1850 by Tenant Right League during the Great Famine. When the potato blight returned to Ireland in 1979, the League boycotted noxious landlords, and its members physically blocked the evictions of farmers. The constant reduction in the homelessness and house demolition resulted in a drastic reduction of the number of deaths. So in other words, because these people were still allowed to live in their houses and not forced to be evicted by the ruling class during a time of crisis, not as many people died. So again, the Great Famine, based on that, it could be considered a genocide. Since the Acts of Union, this is both causes and contributing factors of it. Since the Acts of Union, January of 1801, Ireland had become part of the UK. Extremely extensive power lay in the hands of the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland and Chief Secretary of Ireland, who were appointed by the British government. Ireland sent 150 members of Parliament to the House of Commons in the United Kingdom, and Irish representative peers elected 28 of their own number to sit for life of the House of Lords between 1830 and 1859. 70% of the Irish representatives were landowners or, sons of landowners. In 40 years that followed the Union, selective British governments grappled with the problems of governing a country which had, as Benjamin Disraeli stated in 1844, a starving population, an absentee aristocracy, an alien established Protestant church, and in addition, the weakest exclusive in the world. One historian calculated that between 1801 and 1845 there had been 114 commissions and only 61 special committees inquiring into the state of Ireland, and that without exception their findings prophesied disaster. So in other words, the government was warned well ahead of time that disaster was looming and did fuck all. Ireland was on the verge of starvation, her population rapidly increasing, 3/4 of her laborers unemployed, housing conditions appalling, and the standard of living unbelievably low. Lectures printed in 1847 by John Hughes, Bishop of New York, are compendiary explanation of the adjacent causes, particularly the political climate in which the Irish famine occurred. Another issue was landlords and tenants. During the 18th century, the middleman system of managing landed property was introduced. Rent collection was left to the hands of landlords, their agents or middlemen. This assured the landlord of a greater regular income and relieved them of, direct responsibility while leaving tenants open to exploitation by the middleman. Catholics, the majority of whom were living in conditions of poverty and uncertainty, made up 80% of the population. Because remember, at this time, this is after St. Patrick committed his genocide and got rid of the Druids out of Ireland. At the top of the social pyramid was the ascendancy class. In English and Anglo-Irish families who owned most of the land and held more or less unchecked power over their tenants. Some of their estates were vast. For example, the Earl of Lincoln owned more than 60,000 acres. In other words, 240 kilometers. Many of these absentee landlords lived in England. The rent revenue collected from impoverished tenants were paid minimum wages to raise their crops and livestock for export, and it was mostly sent to England. There again lies the problem where a government is telling them to send more than they have, which we're seeing history repeating itself today. Countries need to worry about themselves first. In 1843, the British government considered that the land question in Ireland was the root of the fundamental cause of the dissatisfaction in the country. They established a royal commission chaired by Earl of Devon to inquire into the laws regarding the occupation of the land. Daniel O'Connell described this commission as perfectly one-sided, being composed of landlords with no tenant representation. In February 1845, Devon reported it would be impossible to adequately describe the provisions which the Irish labourer and his family, habitually silently endured in their many districts. Their only food is the potato, their only beverage, water. Their cabins are seldom protection against weather. A bed or blanket are a rare luxury. And nearly in all their pig and manure heap constructed their own property. The commissioners concluded they could not forbear expression or strong sense of patient endurance, which the laboring class have exhibited under sufferings greater, which we believe than the people of the country of England have to sustain. The commission stated that bad relations, Britain and Anglo-Irish aristocracy had supplemented the Gaelic atrocity in the 17th century, was of a different religion and newer. In 1800, the first Earl of Clare observed that the landlords, that confiscation is their common title. According to the historian Cecil Woodland Smith, landlords regarded the land as a source of income, from which, as most possible, was to be extracted, with the penalty brooding over the dissonant and sullen indignation. In the words of Earl Clare, the landlords are largely viewed the countryside as a hostile place in which to live. Some landlords visited the property only once or twice in a lifetime, if ever. The rents from Ireland were generally spent elsewhere. An estimated £6 billion was remitted out of Ireland in 1842. Now imagine if that £6 million was able to stay in Ireland. The ability of middlemen was measured by the rent income they could not contentedly extract from tenants. They were described in evidence before the commission as land sharks, bloodsuckers, and the most oppressed species of tyrant that ever lent assistance to the destruction of a country. The middlemen leased large tracts of land from the landlords as long as the leases were fixed rents, which they subtly saw fit. They would split a holding into smaller and small parcels so that to increase the amount of rent they could obtain. Tenants could be evicted for reasons such as non-payment of rents, which were high. Sounds familiar of what's going on now. Or a landlord's decision to raise sheep instead of grain crops. A culture paid his rent by working for the landlord, while the spleen and inner laborer paid his short-term lease through temporary day work. As any improvement made on a holding by the tenant became the property of the landlord, when the lease expired or was terminated, the incentive to make improvements was limited. Most tenants had no security of tenature on the land. As tenants at will, they could be turned out whenever the landlord chose. The one exception to this agreement was in Ulster, where, under the practice known as tenant right, a tenant was compensated for any improvement they made to the holding. According to Woodham Smith, the commission stated that the superior prosperity and tranquility of Ulster compared with the rest of Ireland due to the tenants' rights. The landlords in Ireland often used their powers without compulsion, and the tenants lived in dread of them. Woodham Smith writes that in these circumstances, industry and enterprise were extinguished and pleasantry created, which was one of the most dissolute in Ireland. Now let's look at the tenants and their subdivisions. In 1845, 20% of all Irish tenant farms were 0.4 to 2 hectares, or 1 to 5 acres in size, which were while 40% were of 2 to 6 hectares, 5 to 15 acres. Holdings were so small that no crop other than potatoes would suffice to feed a family. Shortly before the famine, the British government reported that poverty was so widespread that 1/3 of all Irish small holdings could not support the tenant families after rent was paid. The families survived only by earnings as a seasonal migrant labor in Ireland and in England and Scotland. Following the famine, reforms were implemented, making it illegal to further divide land holdings. In 1841, census showed a population of just over 8 million. 2/3 of the people depended on agriculture for their survival, but rarely received a working wage. They had to work for their landlords in return for the patch of land they needed to grow enough food for their families. This was a system that forced Ireland's peasantry into the monocultural, since only the potato could be grown in significant quality to meet nutritional needs. The potato was introduced in Ireland as a garden crop of gentry. By the late 17th century, it had become widespread and supplementary rather than a principal food. And the main diet was still based on butter, milk, and grain. With the expansion of the economy between 1760 and 1815 due to the Napoleonic Wars, which had increased the demand for food in Britain, the tillage increased such that the extent that there was less and less land for small farmers, and the potato was chiefly adopted by the people because of its quick growth and on comparatively small space. By 1800, for 1 in 3 of the population, the potato became a staple food, especially in the winter, and eventually became a staple year-round for farmers. A widespread dependency on the single crop and the disproportionate share of potato grown in Ireland being the single variety, the Irish lumper, i.e. the lack of generic variety among the potato plants in England and Ireland, were the two of the reasons why the emergence of the blight had such a devastating effect in Ireland and in small similar areas in Europe. Potatoes were essentially developed for the culture system. They supported the extreme cheap workforce and the cost of lower living standards for the laborer. A potato wage was shaped expanding the agrarian economy. The potato was also used extensively as a fodder crop for livestock. Immediately prior to the famine, approximately 33% of production among the 5 million short tons was normally used in this way. Now, prior to the arrival in Ireland of the blight, only 2 main potato plant diseases had been discovered. One was called dry rot, or taint, and the other was a virus known properly as the curdle. Participated in emphasis, or potato blight, is a variety of parasite, non-photosynthetic organism closely related to brown algae and not fungus. In 1851, the Census of Ireland commissioners recorded 24 failures of the potato crop going back to 1728 of a varying severity. General crop failures through disease or frost was recorded in 1739, 1740, 1770, 1800, and 1807. In 1821 and 1822, the potato crop failed in Munster and in Cork. And in 1830 and 1831, Mayo, Dougall, and Galloway suffered likewise. In 1832, 1833, 1834, and 1836, dry rot and curl caused serious losses, and in 1835, the potato failed in Ulster. Widespread failures throughout Ireland occurred in 1836, 37, 39, 41, and 1844, according to Woodham Smith. The unreliability of the potato was an accepted fact in Ireland. How and when the blight arrived in Europe is still uncertain. However, its almost certainty was not present prior to 1842 and probably arrived in 1844. The origin of the pathogen has been traced to the Tolskia Valley in Mexico, whence it spread first within North America and Europe. In 1845 to 1846, blight was caused by Herb 1 strain of the blight. In 1844, Irish newspapers carried reports concerning the disease that for 2 years had attacked potato crops in America. In 1843 and 1844, blight largely destroyed the potato crops in eastern U.S., and ships from Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York could have carried the diseased potatoes from these areas to European ports. American plant pathologist William C. Paddock stated that blight was transported via potatoes being carried to feed passengers on clipper ships sailing from America to Ireland. Once introduced in Ireland and Europe, blight spread rapidly. By mid-August 1845, it had reached much of northern and central Europe. Belgium and the Netherlands, northern France and southern England had already been affected. In August 16th, 1845, the Gardener's Chronicle of Horticultural Gazette reported a blight of unusual character on the Isle of Wight. A week later, on the 23rd of August, it reported that a fearful malady had broken out among potato crop. In Belgium, the fields are said to be completely desolate. There is hardly a sample in the Covent Garden market. As for the cure for this distemper, there is none. These reports were extensively covered in Irish newspapers. On September the 11th, the Freeman's Journal reported on the appearance of what has been called a cholera in potatoes in Ireland, especially in the north. On the 13th of September, Garden's Chronicle announced, "We stopped the press with very great regret to announce that the potato murrain has unequivocally declared itself in Ireland." Nevertheless, the British government remained optimistic over the next few weeks as it received conflicting reports on when the crop was harvested in October, did the scale of destruction become apparent. Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel wrote to Sir James Graham in mid-October that he found the reports very alarming, but reminded him that there was, according to Woodham Smith, always a tendency of exaggeration in the Irish news. In other words, they were not believed. Crop losses in 1845 had been estimated to anywhere from 1/3 to as high as 1/2 of cultivated acreage. Mansion House Committee in Dublin, which were hundreds of letters were directed from all over Ireland, claiming on November 19th, 1845, to have asserted beyond the shadow of a doubt that considerably more than 1/3 of the entire potato crop had already been destroyed. In 1846, 3/4 of the harvest was lost. By December, 1/3 desolate people were employed in public works, according to Cormac Nagrada. The first attack of the potato blight caused considerable hardship in rural Ireland. From autumn 1846, when the first deaths from starvation were recorded. Seed potatoes were scarce in 1847. Few had been sown, so desperate average yields, hunger continued. 1848, yields were only 2/3 of normal. Since over 3 million people were totally dependent on potatoes for food, hunger and famine were inevitable. Now, I'm going to get into the reaction in Ireland. The Corporation of Dublin sent a memo to the Queen, praying her to call Parliament together. In early Parliament was at this time prologued, and to make the requisition of some public monies, public works, especially railways in England's Town Castle, Belfast, messed with similar suggestions. But neither body asked for charity, according to John Mitchell, one of the leading reporters. Now we have to remember that at this time it was Queen Victoria that was Queen of England. In early November 1845, a deposition from the citizen of Dublin, including the Duke of Leinster, Lord Colquhoun, Daniel O'Connell, and the Lord Mayor, went to Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, Lord Hurstlebury, to offer suggestions such as opening the ports to foreign corn, stopping distillation from grain, prohibiting the exports of foodstuffs, and providing employment through public works. Lord Hillsbury urged them not to be alarmed, that they were premature, that the scientists were inquiring into all the matters. In other words, he didn't take them seriously, and England, because England was getting the food, didn't take it seriously. And that the inspectors of constabulary and supplementary magistrates were charged with making constant reports from their districts, and there was no immediate pressure on the maker. On December 8th, 1945, Daniel O'Connell, head of the Repeal Association, proposed several remedies to the pending disaster. One of the first things he suggested was the introduction of tenant right, as practiced in Ulster, giving the landlord a fair rent for his land, but giving the tenant compensation for any money he might have laid onto the land in permanent improvements. O'Connell noted actions taken by Belgian legislators during the same time, and they had been hit by blights. 2, shutting their ports against export provisions, opening them to imports. He suggested that if Ireland had a domestic parliament, the ports would have been thrown open and abundantly crop raised in Ireland would kept for the people of Ireland, as the Dublin Parliament had done during the food shortages of 1780s. O'Connell maintained that only an Irish Parliament would provide both food and employment for the people. He said that repeal of the Act of Union was a necessity in Ireland and Ireland's only hope. Michael later wrote one on his first widely criticized tactics on the famine. The Last Conquest in Ireland, perhaps published in 1861, is proposed that the British actions during the famine and their treatment of the Irish were deliberate effort at genocide. It contains the stance that there had been since some famous, the Almighty indeed, sent that the potato blight by the English created the famine. Michael was charged with sedition because of his writings and was dropped when he convicted by a packed jury under the newly enacted Treason Felony Act and sentenced to 14 years and transposition to the Bermudas. According to Charles Garin Duffy, the nation insisted that on proper remedy, retaining in the country the food raised by the people until the people were fed, was one of which the rest of Europe had adopted, and by which even parliaments of the Pale, before the Union of Great Britain in 1801, had adopted in previous distress. Competency, as found in letters from the period, and particularly later oral memory, the name of event is in Irish Andoshuni, although with the earlier spelling standard of the era, which was Gaelic script and found written as Drogsogol. In the modern era, this name was loosely translated to the hard time and has been denoted by a capital letter to express the historical meaning. The period of the potato blight in Ireland from 1845 to 1851 was full of political confrontation. A more radical Young Ireland group succeeded from the repeal movement in July 1846 and attempted an armed rebellion in 1848. It was unsuccessful. In 1847, William Smith O'Brien, leader of a Young Ireland party, became one of the founding members of the Irish Confederation to campaign for the repeal of the Union Act and called for the export of grain to be stopped and the ports closed. The following year, he helped organize the short-lived Young Irelander Rebellion in 1848. Now let's look at the government. The first one was the Tory government. Historian F.S.L. Lyons characterized the initial response of the British government to the early, less severe phase of the famine as prompt and relatively successful. Confronted by widespread crop failure in November of 1845, the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, purchased 100,000 pounds worth of maize and cornmeal secretly from America. With Baring Brothers initially acting as his agents, the government hoped that they would not stifle private enterprise and that their actions would not act as distinctive to local relief efforts. Due to poor weather conditions, the first shipment did not arrive in Ireland until the beginning of February 1846. The initial shipments were underground dried kernels, but the few Irish mills in operation weren't equipped for milling maize, and a long, complicated milling process had to be adopted before the meal could be distributed. In addition, before the cornmeal could be consumed, it had to be pretty much cooked again, or eating it could result in severe bowel complaints. Due to its yellow color, the initial unpopularity, it became known as Peel's brimstone. In October 1845, Peel moved to repeal the Corn Laws tariffs on grain, which kept the price of bread high. By ensuing split his party and had insufficient support from his own colleagues to push the measure through. He resigned from the premiership in December, but the opposition was unable to form government, and he was reappointed. In March, Peel set up a program of public works in Ireland, but the famine starvation worsened during 1846, and the repeal of the Corn Laws in that year did not help the starving Irish. The measure split the Conservative Party, leading to the fall of Peel's ministry. On the 25th of June, a second reading of the government's Irish Coercion Bill was defeated by 73 votes in the House of Commons, a combination of Whigs, Radicals, and Irish repealers on the protagonist Conservatives. Peel was forced to resign as Prime Minister on the 29th of June, and the Whig leader, Lord John Russell, became Prime Minister. Now, Whig government. The measures undertaken by Peel's successor, Russell, provided inadequate as the crisis deepened. The new wing administration, influenced by doctrine of laissez-faire, believed that the market would provide the food needed. They refused to interfere with the movement of food to England, and then halted the previous government's food and relief works, leading to many hundreds of thousands of people without access to work, money, or food. Russell's ministry induced a no program for public works that by the end of December 1846 employed some 500,000, but provided impossible to administer. Charles Tevin, who was in charge of administration of the government relief, limited the government's food aid program because of the firm belief in laissez-faire. In January 1847, the government abandoned this policy, realizing that it had failed, and turned to a mixture of indoor and outdoor relief. Direct relief for the former administration of the workhouses through the Irish Poor Laws, the latter soup kitchens, the cost of the poor primarily on the local landlords, some of whom turned an attempt to reduce their liability by evicting their tenants. In June 1847, the Poor Law Amendment Act was passed, which embodied the principle popular in Britain that Irish property must support Irish poverty. The landlord profiteers in Ireland were held in Britain to have created the conditions that led to the famine. However, it was asserted that the British Parliament, since the Act of Union of 1800, was partly to blame. The point raised and illustrated in the London News on February the 13th, 1847, there was no law, it would not be passed at their request, and no abuse, it would not be defended from them. On March 24th, the Times reported that Britain had permitted Ireland's mass poverty, disfaction, and degeneration without a parallel in the world. It allowed profiteers to suck the very life blood of the Irish people. The Gregory Clause of the Poor Law, named after William H. Gregory, prohibited anyone who held at least 1/4 of an acre, 0.1 of a hectare, from receiving relief. In practice, that meant that if a farmer, having sold all his produce to pay rent and taxes, should be reduced, as many thousands of them were there applying for public or outdoor relief, he would not get it until he had first delivered up all of his land to the landlord. Of this law, Michael wrote, "It is the able-bodied idler, only he is that is fed. If he attempted to till but one rood from the ground, he dies." This simple method of ejectment was called passing the paupers through the workhouse. Men went in, a pauper came out, and a pauper came out. These factors combined to drive thousands of people off their land. 90,000 in 1849 and 104,000 in 1850. In 1849, the Accompanied Estates Act allowed landlords' estates to be auctioned off upon the petition of creditors. Estates with debts were then auctioned off at low prices. Then wealthy British speculators purchased the lands, took a very harsh view of tenant farmers who continued renting. The rents were raised and the tenants evicted to create large cattle grazing pastures. Between 1849 and 1854, some 50,000 families were evicted. Now, let's hear the response of the Royal Navy of Queen Victoria. The Royal Navy Squadron stationed in Cork, Ireland, under the command of Rear Admiral High Piggott, undertook sufficiency relief operation from 1846 to 1847, transporting government relief to the port of Cork. and the other ports along the Irish Cork, being ordered on January 2nd, 1846 to assist distressed regions. On the 27th of December, 1846, Tervan ordered every available steamer to Ireland to assist in relief. And on January 14, 1847, Piggott received orders to also distribute supplies from the British Relief Association and treat them indicatively to government aid. In addition, some naval officers under Piggott oversaw logistics and relief operations further inland from Cork. In February 1847, Tervan ordered the Royal Navy surgeons dispatched in order to provide medical care for those suffering from illness that accompanied starvation. Desperate medicines that were in short supply on the island, and assist in poor sanitary burials for those already deceased. These efforts, though significant, were insignificant in preventing the mass mortality from famine and disease. Let's look at food exports from 1842 to 1841. In 1842, this is Irish grain trade in units of 100,000. This is exported out, is 2,538 to bringing in 280. That means they had a surplus going out of 2,258, which they could have used in Ireland. In maize imports, only 20. In 1843, the exports were 3,206, only 74 imports. That gives a surplus of 3,000 going out, 1,032. Only 3 maize imports. In 1844, the grains that left in export was 2,801, 150 only imported, which left a surplus going out of 2,651, only 5 maize imports. In 1845, 3,252 export grain went out. Only 147 came in, leaving going out of 3,105 and only importing 34 maize. In 1846, 1,826 were exported. Only 987 came in, leaving going out of 839, and bringing in maize exports came in at that time of 614. In 1847, only 970 were exported. 4,519 were imported. This is where it starts a little bit turning around. Minus 3,549 with maize imports of 3,287. In 1848, 1,953 were exported, 2,186 were imported, leaving a negative 233. 1,546 were imported maize. In 1849, 1,437 were exported, 2,908 were imported, leaving a negative 1,471, and maize import of 1,897. In 1850, 13,029 were exported, 2,357 were imported, leaving 1,028 negative surplus, 1,159 imports of maize. And in the last year, 1851, 1,325 were exported, 3,158 were imported, 1,838 negative surplus, 1,755 imports of maize. Now, many of the Irish people, noted Michael, believed that Ireland continued to produce sufficient food to feed its population during the famine, and starvation resulted from the exports. And if we look at it, at the numbers I just read, he's correct. According to historian James Donnelly, the picture of island people starving as food was exported was the most powerful image in the nationalist construct of the famine. However, according to statistics, food imports exceeded exports during the famine, though grain imports only rarely became sufficient after the spring of 1847. And much debate has been concluded within narrow perimeters, focusing on the almost exclusively on national estimates, with little attempt to disengage the data by region or by product. The amount of food export in the late 1846 was only 1/10 the amount of potato harvest lost to blight. The historian Cecil Woodham Smith wrote, "The Great Hunger, Ireland, 1845 to 1849. That is no issue he provoked so much anger that embodied relations between England and Ireland as the indispensable fact that the huge quantities of food were exported from Ireland to England throughout the period when the people of Ireland were dying of starvation. While in addition to the maize imports, 4 times as much wheat was imported into Ireland at that height of the famine as exported. Much of the imported wheat was used as livestock feed." Woodham Smith added that the provision via the Poor Law Union, workers by the Act of 1838 had to be paid by rates of levied upon the local property owners. And in areas where the famine was the worst, the tenants could not pay their rents to enable the landlords to fund the rates, and therefore the workhouses, only by selling food, some of which would inevitably be exported, could the vicious cycle be created whereby the rents and rates would be paid and the workhouses funded. Relief through the workhouse system was simply overwhelmed by the enormous scale and duration of the famine. Nicholas McViver, parish priest of Kells, wrote in October 1845, "One of my most minute personal inspiration of the potato crop in the most fertile potato growing locale is found in my inexpressibly painful conviction that 1 family in 20 of the people will not have a single potato left on Christmas Day next. Many are the fields that I have examined, and testimony of the most solemn can I tender, that the great bulk of those fields, all potato sizable enough to be sent to the table, irreparably damaged. While for remaining completely souter fields with very little hopes are entertained in consequence of the daily rapid development of the deplorable disease. With starvation as outdoors grimly starting us, vessels laden with our sole hopes of existence, our provisions are hourly waffled from every port, from one milling establishment to have the last night seen the last not 50 dried loads meals of moving on to Dorotha, hence to go feed the foreigner, leaving starvation and death, the sure as certain fate of toll and sweet that raised its food. For their respective inhabitants, England, Holland, Scotland, Germany, are taking an early necessary precautions, getting provisions from every possible part of the globe. And I ask, are Irishmen alone unworthy the sympathies of the patriot generally or parental government? Let Irishmen themselves take heed before the provisions are gone. Let those too who have sheep and oxen and haggards, self-preservation is the first law of nature. The right of starving to try and sustain existence is the right far and away paramount to every right that the property confers. Infinitely more precious in the eyes of reason and adorable eye of the omniscient and omnipotent Creator is that life of the last and least of human beings than the whole united property of the entire universe. The appalling character of the crisis renders the delicacy by criminal and imperative calls for the timely and explicit notice of the principles that will not fail to provide terrible arms at the hands of neglected and abandoned starving people." In May 5th, 2020, issue of the Dublin Review of Books, editor Mars Earls wrote, Dr. McCoy, in his grim forebodings and the apocalyptic fear, was closer to the truth than sanguine rationales quoted in the newspapers. But McCoy, like many others, overestimated the likelihood of mass rebellion. And even the great clerical friend and poor could hardly have contemplated the depth of social and economical and cultural destruction which would persist and deepen over the following century and beyond. It was politics that turned a disease of potatoes and tomatoes into famine. It was politics which ensured the disastrous after effects would disfigure numerous and future generations. Let's look at the charity at that time. Total charitable donations for famine relief might have been about 1.5 million, of which 856,500 came from outside of Ireland. Donations within Ireland are harder to trace. £338,000 of donations were officially registered. But some allowances is made for less formal donations. Of Irish total probably exceeds that of Britain, £520,000. Only Britain donated. People of Irish descent also contributed to funds raised outside Ireland, and those donations would be included in the region where the donation was made. English Protestants donated more to the Irish famine relief than any other source outside of Ireland. Let's look at the contributions and by region. In Britain, only £525,000. USA, £170,000. Indian Ocean, £50,000. France, £26,000. Canada, $22,000. West Indies, $17,000. These are all in pounds. Italy, $13,000. Australia, $9,000. Netherlands, Belgium, and Denmark, $5,000. Germany and Switzerland, $4,500. South Africa, $4,000. Latin America, $3,500. Russia, $2,500. The Ottoman Empire, $2,000. Other British dependencies, $2,000. Spain and Portugal, $1,000. For a total of $856,500. That's the only help that Ireland got. Now just imagine if that happened in today's. Countries would be donating billions to help out. So why couldn't the governments at the time do more than just a few £1,000s? Especially in wealthy countries like Russia. It's sad. And even Britain. Large sums of money were donated by charities. The first foreign campaign in December 1845 included a Boston Repeal Association and the Catholic Church. Something good the Catholic Church did. Celtic is credited with making the first larger donations in 1846, summing to around £14,000. The money raised included contributions by Irish soldiers serving, their Irish people employed by East India Company, Russian Tsar Alexander II sent funds, and Queen Victoria herself donated £2,000. We'll not get into that. According to legend, Sultan Amr I of the Ottoman Empire originally offered to send £10,000, but was asked either by the British diplomats or his own minister to reduce it to 1,000 to avoid donating more than the Queen. U.S. President James K. Pollock donated $50, and in 1847, Congressman Abraham Lincoln donated $10. Pope Paulus the Ninth also made a personal contribution of 1,000 scaldi, approximately £213, for famine relief in Ireland, and authorized collections in Rome. Most sufficiently, on the 25th of March, 1847, Paulus the Ninth issued an incursus perdicius notaris, which called the whole Catholic world to contribute money-wise and spiritually to Irish relief. Many figures behind the international Catholic fundraising to Ireland were the rector of Pompeius and Irish College, Paul Cullen, and the professor of Society of St. Vincent de Paul, Gulius Guzman. International fundraising activities received donations from factions as diverse as Venezuela, Australia, South Africa, Mexico, Russia, and Italy, in addition to the religious and non-religious organizations coming to the assistance of famine victims. The British Relief Association was the largest group founded in January 1847 by Leonard de Rocha Albert Smith and other prominent bankers and aristocrats. The association raised money throughout England, America, and Australia. Their funding drive was benefited by Queen's Letter, a letter from Queen Victoria appealing for money to relieve the distress in Ireland. With this initial letter, the association raised £171,533. A second, somewhat less successful than the Queen's Letter, was issued in 1847. In total, the association raised approximately £390,000 for Irish relief. Private initiatives such as the Central Relief Committee and the Society of Friends, Quakers, attempted to fill the gap caused by the end of the government relief, and eventually the government reinstated relief works, although beneficially slowed and release of food staple. Thousands of dollars were raised in the U.S., including $170 collected from a group of Native American Chickasaw. That totals in 1929 to $5,218. So even the Native Americans, the Chickasaws, donated. Judy Ann, editor of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma's newspaper, Bisnock, wrote, "It had been just 16 years since the Chickasaw people had experienced the Trail of Tears, and they had faced starvation. It was an amazing gesture. To mark the 150th anniversary, 8 Irish people retraced the Trail of Tears." Contribution to the U.S. during the famine were heightened and highlighted by Senator Harry Clay, who wrote, "No imagination can conceive, no tongue can express, no brush paint the horrors of the scenes which are daily exhibited in Ireland." He called upon Americans to remind them of the practice of charity was the greatest act of humanity that could do. In total, 180 vessels sailed from the U.S. to Ireland with relief goods, valued at $540,145. Specifically, states which provided aid included South Carolina and Philadelphia. Pennsylvania was the second most important state for famine relief in the U.S. and the second largest shipping port to aid Ireland. The state hosted Philadelphia Irish Famine Relief Committee, Catholics, Methodists, Quakers. Carolina railed around the efforts to help those experiencing famine. They raised donations of money, food, and clothing to help the victims of the famine. Irish immigrants made up 39% of white population in the southern cities. Historian Harvey Strom claims the states ignored all their racial, religious, and political differences and support the cause for relief. Now, let's look at eviction of the time. Landlords were responsible for paying the rates of every tenant whose yearly rent was £4 or less. Landlords whose land had crowded with poor tenants were now faced with large bills. Many began clearing the poor tenants from their small plots and letting the land in larger plots for over £4, which then reduced their debts. In 1846, there had been some clearances, but the great mass of evictions came in 1847. According to James S. Donry Jr., it is impossible to be sure how many people were evicted during the years of the famine and its immediate aftermath. It was only in 1849 that the police began to keep count, and they recorded almost a total of 250,000 people were officially evicted between 1849 and 1854. Keep in mind, more than that came in 1847, but weren't recorded. Donnelly considered this to be an underestimate, that if the figures were to include the number pressured into voluntary surrenders during the whole period of 1846 to 1854, the figure would almost be certainly 500,000 persons. While Helen Linton says that there was also thousands of voluntary surrenders, she notes that there were precious little voluntary about them. Gee, sounding familiar. In some cases, tenants were persuaded to expect a small sum of money to leave their homes, cheated into believing that the workhouses would take them in. West Clare was one of the worst areas for evictions. The landlords turned thousands of families out and demolished their cabins. Captain Kennedy in April 1848 estimated that 1,000 houses with an average of 6 people in each had been leveled since November. The Merun family of Stockholm House evicted 3,000 people in 1847, but were still able to dine on lobster soup. That's the Mahon family, Mahon. After Clare, the worst area of evictions were County Mayo. According to 10% of all evictions between 1849 and 1854. George Brigham, 3rd Earl of Langton, owned over 60,000 acres, was among the worst evicting landlords. That is the Bingham. He was quoted as to saying he would not breed paupers to pay priest. Having turned into the parish of Belmore over 2,000 tenants alone, he then used the cleared land as grazing farms. In 1848, the Marquis d'Esquil owed £16,050 to West Union. He was also an evicting landlord, though he claimed to be selective, saying that he was only getting rid of the idle and dishonest. Altogether, he cleared about 25% of his tenants. In 1847, Bishop Meth Thomas Nutley described his personal recollection of the evictions in a pastoral letter to his clergy. 700 beings were driven from their home in one day and set adrift on the world to gratify the caprice of one new. Before God and man probably deserved less consideration than the least and the least of them. The horrid scenes I then witnessed, I must remember all my life long. The wailing of women, the screams, the terror, the consternation of the children, the speechless agony of honest, industrious men wrung tears of grief from all who saw them. I saw officers and men of large police force who were obligated to attend on occasion cry like children at beholding of the cruel sufferings of the very people whom they would be obliged to butcher had they offered the least resistance. The land proprietors in a circle all around, and for many miles in every direction, warned their tenantry with threats of their direct vengeance against the humanity of acceding to any of them the hospitality of a single night's shelter. And in little more than 3 years, nearly a fourth of them lay quietly in their graves. This is part of the reason why the Irish have a thing that if you come to their house, you won't leave hungry. The population in Dumbrook, townland in County Meath, plummeted 67% between 1841 and 1851. In the neighboring Springville, it fell 54%. There were 50 houses in Springville in 1841 and only 11 left in 1871. According to Linton, evictions might have taken place earlier, but for fear of the secret societies, however, there was, now greatly weakened by the famine, revenge still occasionally took place, with 7 landlords being shot, 6 fatally during the autumn and the winter of 1847. 10 other occupiers of land through the whole tenants were also murdered, she says. One such landlord's reprisal occurred in western Roscommon. The notorious Mayor Dennis Moncon enforced thousands of his tenants into eviction before the end of 1847. With an estimated 60% decline in population in some parishes, he was shot dead that year. In East Roscommon, where conditions were more begin, the estimated decline in population was under 10%. Lord Carleton, alarmed at the number of landlords being shot and that this might mean rebellion, asked for special powers. Lord John Russell was not sympathetic to his appeal. Lord Carleton believed that the landlords themselves were mostly responsible for the tragedy in the first place, saying, "It is quite true that the landlords in England were not likely to be shot like hares for that partridge, but neither does any landlord in England turn out 50 persons at once and burn their houses over their heads, giving them no provisions for the future." The Crime Outrage Act was passed in December 1847. As a compromise, and additional troops were sent to Ireland. The Gregory Clause, described by Donnell as a vicious amendment to the Irish Poor Law. It had been successful. Tory amendment to the Wing Poor Relief Bill, which became law in early 1847. There's potential to estate clearing device was widely recognized in Parliament, although not in advance. At first, the Poor Law Commissioners and inspectors viewed the clause as a vulnerable instrument for the most cost-effective administration of public relief. But the drawbacks soon became apparent. Even from the administrative perspective, they would soon view as little more than murderous from a humanitarian perspective. According to Donnelly, it became obvious that a quarter-acre caused an indirectly death-dealing instrument. Now let's look at emigration, which means people leaving during that time. At least 1 million people have thought to have immigrated as a result of the famine. There were about 1 million long-distance immigrants between 1846 and 1851, mainly of North America. The total given in the 1851 census is 967,908. Short-distance immigrants, mainly to Britain, may have numbered 200,000 or more. While the famine was responsible for the significant increase in immigration from Ireland, from anywhere from 45% to nearly 85%, depending on the year and country, it was not the sole cause. The beginning of mass emigration from Ireland can be traced to the mid-18th century, where some 250,000 people left Ireland over a period of 50 years to settle in the New World. Irish economist Cormac Lagrada estimates that between 1 million and 1.5 million people emigrated during the 30 years between 1815, when Napoleon was defeated in Waterloo, and 1845, when the Great Famine began. However, during the worst of the famine, emigration somewhere reached around 250,000 in 1 year alone, with Western Ireland seeing the most. Families did not migrate en masse, but younger members of the families did, so much so that emigration became a rite of passage, as evidenced by the data show that unlike similar emigrations throughout the world history, women emigrated just as often, just as early, in the same numbers as men. The emigrants would send remittance reaching a total of $1,404,000 by 1851 back to their families in Ireland, which in turn allowed another member of the family to leave. Emigration during the famine years of 1845 to 1850 was primarily to England, Scotland, South Wales, North America, and Australia. Many of those fleeing to the Americas used the McCall line. One city that experienced particularly strong influx of Irish immigrants was Liverpool, with at least 1/4 of the city's population being Irish-born by 1851. This would heavily influence the city's identity and culture, in the coming years earning the nickname of Ireland's second capital. Liverpool became the only place outside Ireland to elect an Irish nationalist to Parliament when it elected T.P. O'Connor in 1885, and continuously re-elected him unopposed until his death, until 1929. As of 2020, it is estimated that 3/4 of the people from the city have Irish ancestry. Of more than 100,000 Irish that sailed to Canada in 1847, it is estimated that 1 out of 5 died of disease and malnutrition, including over 5,000 at Grosse Île, Quebec, an island in the St. Lawrence River used to quarantine ships near Quebec City. Overcrowded, poorly maintained, and badly provisioned vessels known as coffin ships sailed from small unregulated harbours in the west of Ireland, and convention of British safety requirements and mortality rates were high. In 1851, census reported that more than half of the inhabitants of Toronto were Irish. In 1847 alone, 38,000 Irish flooded a city, fewer than 20,000 citizens. Other Canadian cities such as Quebec City, Montreal, Ottawa, Kingston, Hamilton, St. John also reached large numbers by 1878. Also, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. In 1871, 55% of St. John residents were Irish natives or children of Irish-born parents. Unlike the United States, Canada could not close its ports to Irish ships because it was part of the British Empire. So immigrants could obtain cheap passage in return for empty lumber holds. In America, most Irish became city dwellers. Little money, many had to settle in the cities that, like ships, they had landed on. By 1850, the Irish made up a quarter population of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. The famine marked the beginning of the depopulation of Ireland in the 19th century. The population had increased by 13 to 14% in the first 3 decades of the 19th century, between 1831 and 1841. The population grew by 5%. Application of the Malthus' idea of population expanding geometrically while resources increased asymmetrically was popular during the famine of 1817 and 1822, but by 1830s they were seen as overly simplistic, and Ireland's problem was seen as less as an excess of population than a lack of capital investment. The population of Ireland was increasing no faster than that of England, which suffered no equivalent catastrophe. By 1854, between 1.5 and 2 million Irish left their country due to the evictions, starvation, and harsh living conditions. Now, the not so fun part, even though this hasn't really been fun. Let's talk about the death toll. It is not known exactly how many people died during the period of the famine, although it was believed that more died from disease than from famine. State registration of births, marriages, and deaths had not begun, and records kept by the Catholic Church are incomplete. One possible estimate has been reached by comparing the expected population with the eventual numbers in 1850. A census taken in 1841 recorded a population of 8,175,124. A census immediately after the famine in 1851 counted 6,552, 3,800, a drop of over 1.5 million in 10 years. The Census Commissioners estimated that the normal rate of population increase, that the population should have grown to just over 9 million if the famine hadn't occurred. On the in-development of the Great Irish Famine produced the Geography Development of the University College of Canada, Cork. The population of Ireland section states that together with census figures being called low before the famine, it reads that it is now generally believed that over 8.7 million people populated the land of Ireland prior to its shrinking. In 1851, the Census Commissioners collected information on the number who have died in each family since 1841, and the cause section, the year of death, recorded 21,770 total deaths from starvation in the previous decade and 400,720 deaths from disease. Listed these were fever, dysthropia, dysentery, cholera, smallpox, and influenza, the last being the two main killers. The commissioners acknowledged that their figures were incomplete and that the true number of deaths is probably higher. The greater the amount of destitution and of mortality, the less will be the amount of recorded death derived through any household form. For not only were whole families swept away by disease, but whole villages were affected from off the land. Later historians agree that the 1851 death tables were flawed and probably underestimated the level of mortality. The combination of institutional and figures provided by individuals gives an incomplete and biased count of fatalities during the famine. Cormac O'Grada, referring to the work of W.A. MacArthur, writes that specialists have long known that the Irish death tables were inaccurate and uncounted the number of deaths. S.H. Constantine estimates that 800,000 deaths on reciprocity information contained in the 1851 census and elsewhere, and now registered as too low. Modern historian Joseph Lee says at least 800,000, and R.F. Foster estimates that at least 750 died, mostly through disease during the cholera and later stages of the Holocaust. He further notes that recent sophisticated computation estimate exceeds the death from 1846 to 1851 as between 1 million and 105,000 million, After careful critique of this, other statisticians arrived at the figure of 1 million. Joel Mosker estimates that an average country level ranges from 1.1 million to 1.5 million deaths between 1856 and 1851. Mark produced two sets of data which contained the upper bound, lower bound estimates, which showed not much of a difference in regional patterns. True figures is likely to lie between the two extremes of 1.5 and 1 million. The most widely accepted estimate is 1 million. This is the decline in population between 1841 and 1851 in Ireland in percentages for 5 different levels. In Leinster, in Ireland, it decreased by 15.3%. In Munster, it decreased by 22.5%. In Ulster, 15.7%. In Connacht, 28.8%, for a total of all Ireland of 20% decline in population. Another area of uncertainty lies in the descriptions of the diseases given tenants that caused their relatives' death. Through 1851, censuses have rightly criticized and underestimating the true extent of mortality. It does provide the framework for medical history of the Great Famine. The disease that badly affected the population fell into two categories: famine-induced disease and diseases of nutritional deficiency. Of the nutritional deficiency diseases, the most commonly experienced were starvation and marasms, as well as the condition at the time called dropsy. Dropsy was a popular name given to the symptoms of several diseases, one of which is Kolskaver, in association with starvation. However, the greatest mortality was not from nutritional deficiency disease, but from famine-induced ailments. The malnourished are very vulnerable to infections. Therefore, these are more severe when they occurred. Mixed dysphoria, diarrhea, tuberculosis, most respiratory infections, whooping cough, many intestinal peritonitis, and cholera were strongly conditioned by nutritional status. Potential lethal diseases such as smallpox and influenza were so virulent that their spread was independent of nutrition. The best example of this phenomenon was fever, which exacted the greatest death toll. In the popular mind, it is medical opinion that fever and famine were closely related. Social dislocation and congregation of the hungry at soup kitchens, food depots, and overcrowded workhouses created conditions that were ideal for spreading infectious disease such as typhus, typhoid, and relapsing fever. The general diseases will result in poor hygiene, being bad sanitation and dietary changes. The concluding attack on the population, incapacitated by famine, was derived by cholera, which had visited Ireland briefly in 1830s and the following decade. It spread uncontrollably across Asia through Europe and Britain, finally reaching Ireland in 1849. Some scholars estimate that the population of Ireland was reduced by 20 to 25%. Now, let's look after the famine. Ireland's mean age of marriage in 1830 was 23.8 for women and 27.5 for men, where they had been once 21 for women and 25 for men. Those who never married numbered 10% of the population. In 1840, they had respectively risen to 24.4 and 27.7. In the decades after the famine, the age of marriage had risen to 28 to 29 for women and 33 for men. As many of the third of Irishmen, a quarter of the Irishmen never married due to the low wages and the chronic epidemic of problems and discouraging universal marriage. One consequence of the increased number of orphaned children was that some young men were turned into prostitution to provide for themselves. Some of the women became wrens of the Cara, were famine orphans. The potato blight would return to Ireland in 1879, though by the rural culture tenant farmers and labourers in Ireland began the land war described in one of the biggest large agrarian movements to take place in the 19th century. By the time the potato blight returned in 1879, the Land League was led by Michael Duvet, who was born during the Great Famine and whose family had been evicted when Duvet was only 4 years old, encouraged Maya's boycott of the nauseous landlords and some members of physically blocking evictions. Politically, however, would soon be suppressed. Despite close to 1,000 interned under the 1881 Coercion Act for suspended membership, with the reduction of rate of homelessness and the increased physical and political networks eroding the landlordism system, the severely following this shorter famine will be limited. According to the linguist Eric Fox-Ponix, surprisingly for a country renowned for its rich musical heritage, only a small number of folk songs can be traced back to the demographics of cultural catastrophe brought about by the Great Famine. And he fears that this is the subject of generally avoided by collectors of the 18th and 19th centuries, did not collect the songs they heard in the Irish language, as the language was often regarded as dead or not delicate enough for educated ears. Of songs that have survived, probably the best known is Sicabrin. Immigration has been an important source of inspiration for songs of the Irish during the 20th century. Now, like I said, this is going to be a long one today. Let's look at the analysis of the government's role. Contemporary analysis. Contemporary opinion was shared critical of the Russian government's response to the management of the crisis. From the start, there were accusations that the government failed to grasp the magnitude of the disaster. Sir James Graham, who had served as Home Secretary in Sir Robert Peel's late government, wrote to the Peel that, in his opinion, the real extent of the magnitude of the Irish difficulty and underestimated by the government and cannot be met with measures within the strict economic science. This criticism was not confined to outside critiques. The Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, Lord Colquhoun, wrote in a letter to Russell on the 26th of April, 1849, urging that the government pose additional relief measures. I don't think that there's another legislator in Europe that would have disregarded the suffering as now exists in the west of Ireland, or coldly persist in the policy extermination. Also, in 1849, Chief Poor Law Commissioner Edward Twilson resigned to protest over the Rate and Aid Act, which provided additional funds to the poor law through a 6-day in a pound levy on reliable properties in Ireland. Twilson testified that comparatively thriving sums were required for Britain to spare itself of deep disgrace, permitting the miserable fellow subjects die of starvation. According to Peter Gray in his book, The Irish Famine, the government spent $7 million for relief in Ireland between 1845 and 1850, representing the less than 1/2% of Britain's gross national product over 5 years. Contemporaries noted sharp contrast with the $20 million compensation given to the West Indian slave owners in 1830s. Other critics maintained that even after the government recognized the scope of the crisis, it failed to take significant steps to address it. John Michael, one of the leaders of the Young Ireland movement, wrote in 1860, "I've called it an agricultural famine. It is to say that it was a famine which desolated a rich and fertile land and produced every year abundance and subabundance to sustain all of her people, and many more. The English indeed call the famine a dispersion of providence, and accusable is entirely on the blight on potatoes. But potatoes failed in a like manner all over Europe. Yet there was no famine save in Ireland. The British account of the matter, then, is first a fraud, second a blasphemy. The Almighty indeed sent the potato blight in England that created the famine." Still, the other critics saw the reflecting the government response as its attitude to so-called Irish question. The economics professor in Oxford wrote that the famine would not kill more than 1 million people and would scarcely be enough to do any good. In 1848, Genoslaughter suggested that Russell was a student of the Elizabethan poet Edmure Spenser, who calculated how far the English colonization and English policy might have most effective carried out English starvation. Charles Serison, a civil servant most directly responsible for the government's handling of the famine, described it in 1848 as a direct stroke of all the wise and all merciful providence, which labeled the deep and irreversible root of social evil. He affirmed that the famine was a sharp but effectual remedy by which the cure is likely to be effective. God grant that the generation of which this opportunity has been offered may rightly perform its part. Sounds like genocide to me. Now, let's look at a historical analysis of the famine itself. Kristen Kenley has written the major tragedy of the Irish famine of 1845 to 1558 marked a watershed in modern history. Its occurrence, however, was neither inevitable nor unavoidable. The underlying factors which contributed to the cause of the famine were aggravated by an inadequate government response. Kenny notes that the government had to do something to help to alleviate the suffering, but that it became apparent that the government was using its information not merely to help, it formulated its relief policies, to help it formulate relief policies, but also an opportunity to facilitate various long-desired changes within Ireland. Some also pointed out that the structure of the British Empire as a contributing factor. James Anthony Fard wrote that England governed Ireland from what she deemed her own interest, making a calculation on the gross balance of her trade ledgers and leaving moral obligations aside, as if right and wrong had been blotted in the statute book of the universe. Dennis Clarke, an Irish-American historian and critique of the empire, claimed that the famine was the culmination of generations of neglect, misrule, and misrepresentation. It was an epic of English colonial cruelty and inadequacy for the landless cabin dwellers. It meant emigration or extinction. Remember, at this time, it was Queen Victoria that ruled. The position of the British government. The British government has not expressly apologized for its role in the famine, but in 1897, a commemoration event in County Cork, the actor Gabriel Brim read out a message by Prime Minister Tony Blair that acknowledged the inadequacy of the government response. It asserted that those who have governed in London at the time failed their people through standing by while a crop failure turned into a mass human tragedy. The message was well received in Ireland, but it was understood as long sought after British apology. Archived documents released in 2021 show that the message was not in fact written or approved by Blair, who could not be reached by his aides at the time, and therefore approved by Blair's principal private secretary, John Holmes, on his own initiative. Okay, now the big question and how I will end this. Let's talk about the genocide question. The famine remains a controversial event in Irish history. Debate and discussions about whether the British government's response to the failure of the potato crop and continued exportation of food crops and livestock constituted a genocide remains a subject of political debate. Virtually all historians reject the claim of the constituted genocide due in part to the lack of intent behind related deaths. For a mass casualty death atrocity defined as genocide, it must include an international destruction of people. This technically did. In 1996, the U.S. state New Jersey indicated that the famine in the Holocaust and genetical curriculum of secondary schools. So as of 1996, in the schools in New Jersey, it became known as a Holocaust and genocide of the Irish people. In the 1990s, Irish-American lobbying groups campaigned viciously to include the study of Irish famine in school curriculums, alongside the studies of Holocaust and slavery and other similar atrocities. In New Jersey curriculum was published such lobbying groups, was drafted by libertarian James Mullen. Following criticism of the New Jersey Holocaust Commission requesting statements from two academics that the Irish famine was genocide, which was eventually provided by law professors Charles E. Rice and Francis Boyle, who had been not previously known for studying Irish history. They concluded that the British government deliberately pursued a race and ethnicity-based policy aimed at destroying Irish people, and that the policy of mass starvation amounted to genocide per retrospect application of Article 2 of the Hugh Convention of 1948. Now, Irish historian Cormac McGrath rejected the claim that the famine was a genocide and stated that no academic historian continues to take claim of genocide seriously. Remember, he was before this in 1990s. He argued that genocide includes malicious intent that was never in most bigoted race commissioners the day sought after extermination of Irish. He also stated that most people in Whitehall hoped for better times in Ireland. Additionally, he stated that the claims of genocide looks the enormous cottage facing relief agencies, both central, local, private, and public. O'Grada thinks that the case of neglect is easier to sustain than the case of genocide. Also rejected, W.E. Robeson also rejected the genocide claim. James Darcy Donaldson, Jr., historian of the University of Wisconsin, wrote in his book of Landlord and Tenant in the 19th Century Ireland. The government's abject failure to stop or even slow the downing of currents of evictions contributed to the major way to the enshrining the idea that the English supported genocide in the Irish popular mind, or perhaps one should say the Irish mind. It was a notion that appealed to many educated and discriminating men and women, and not only revolutionary minority. It is my contention that while genocide was non-fact committed, it happened during the result of clearances that had looked like genocide in Irish myth. Historian Donald Aiken, who has written 24 books on Ireland, stated that when you see the word Holocaust used in regard to famine, you know that you're encountering a famine porn. It eventually part of the presentation that is historically unbalanced, and like all other kind of pornography, it is distinguished by covert and sometimes overt appeal to the misanthropy and almost incitement and hatred. In 2019, Marine legislators argued that the inclusion of the education about Ireland in the Famine and Holocaust Bill and Act required education about the Holocaust. Irish State broadcaster RTE aired a two-part documentary on the hungers, the story of the Irish famine in 2020. In it, Brendan O'Leary, professor of political science, argued the use of the term Genoslaughter rather than the genocide, because in his view, Genoslaughter is a more accurately descriptive term for the British response to potato blight than the term genocide. O'Leary pointed out that this decision-making by the government of the day was based on the capitalist principles rather than ethnicity. Its aim was to reduce the tax burden on the middle class, who were both main ethnicities, by clearing the unproductive, landless poor of Ireland. According to the historian Liam Kelly, an editorial in the English Echo by James Paul Sweeney stated, "The genocide of the Great Famine is distinct. In fact, the British created the conditions of dire hopelessness and desperate dependence on the potato crop through a series of sadistic, debasing, premeditated, and barbarous penal laws, which deliberately and systematically stripped the Irish of even the least semblance of basic human freedom. When the blight struck the Irish totally vulnerable, it was a nuanced genocide. He continues that the manipulated fate by pushing people to the brink of annihilation and then turning away so not to hear the wailing. However, Kenny does not believe himself that the famine constituted genocide. There is no case of genocide when you think of it as part of the British government politics of Ireland. 750,000 people working on public relief schemes when you have 3 million people on one stage receiving soup from soup kitchens right across Ireland locally. Historian Mark Thatcher writes that a nationalistic literature exists about the famine that objectifies and ignores the effects of natural factors instead of place of entirely to blame British government, which he compares similarly to the reconstructionist and inadequate narratives of the Ukrainian nationalists about the Soviet famine of 1830 to 1833. Trugger criticizes these nationalistic perceptions as being ungrounded in reality and at odds with the scholarship on the matter, and even those historians who are most critical of British policymaking during the period accept the potato blight as the main overreaching cause of the famine. Professor of history John Linser writes that binary farming and the debate about British governance, and particularly Tversky's actions as being good or bad, as unsatisfactory, and its entirely debate surrounding the question of genocide simply objectifies the complex factors behind the actions of the government. Now, is it time for you to think that you've listened to all the facts presented in history by historians? Do you consider it a genocide? Or you consider it Genoslaughter? That, my dear listener, is something you will have to weigh. And yes, this is one of Ireland's holocausts.